monetary policy framework is built on the unchanging foundation of our mandate from Congress to foster maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. We remain fully committed to fulfilling our statutory mandate, and the revisions to our framework will support that mission across a broad range of economic conditions. Our revised statement on longer-run goals and monetary policy strategy, which we refer to as our consensus statement to save time, describes how we pursue our dual mandate goals. It is designed to give the public a clear sense of how we think about monetary policy, and that understanding is important both for transparency and accountability, and for making monetary policy more effective. The changes we made in this review are a natural progression grounded in our ever-evolving understanding of our economy. We continue to build upon the initial consensus statement adopted in 2012 under Chairman Ben Bernanke's leadership. Today's revised statement is the outcome of the second public review of our framework, which we conduct at 5-year intervals. This year's review included 3 elements: Fed Listens events at reserve banks around the country, a flagship research conference, and policymaker discussions and deliberations supported by staff analysis at a series of F1.
Searching for a reliable used sedan? Shop the area's best selection of affordable vehicles
and to make sure that our framework is suitable across a broad range of economic conditions. At the same time, the framework needs to evolve with changes in the structure of the economy and our understanding of those changes. The Great Depression presented different challenges from those of the Great Inflation and the Great Moderation, which in turn are different from the ones we face today. At the time of the last review, we were living in a new normal, characterized by the proximity of interest rates to the effective lower bound, or ELB, along with low growth, low inflation, and a very flat Phillips curve, meaning that inflation was not very responsive to slack in the economy. To me, a statistic that captures that era is that our policy rate was stuck at the ELB for 7 long years following the onset of the global financial crisis in late 2008. Many here will recall the sluggish growth and painfully slow recovery of that era. It appeared highly likely that if the economy experienced even a mild downturn, our policy rate would be back at the ELB very quickly, probably for another extended period. Inflation and inflation expectations could then decline in a weak economy, raising real interest rates as nominal rates were pinned near zero. Higher real rates would further weigh on job growth and reinforce the downward pressure on inflation and inflation expectations, triggering an adverse dynamic. The economic conditions that brought the policy rate to the ELB and drove the 2020 framework changes were thought to be rooted in slow-moving global factors that would persist for an extended period. And they might well have done so, if not for the pandemic. The 2020 consensus statement included several features that addressed the ELB-related risks that had become increasingly prominent over the preceding 2 decades. We emphasized the importance of anchored inflation, longer-term inflation expectations, to support both our price stability and maximum employment goals. Drawing on an extensive literature on strategies to mitigate risks associated with the ELB, we adopted flexible average inflation targeting, a make-up strategy to ensure that inflation expectations would remain well anchored, even with the ELB constraint. In particular, we said that following periods when inflation had been running persistently above 2%, appropriate monetary policy would likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. In the event, rather than low inflation in the ELB, the post-pandemic reopening brought the highest inflation in 40 years to economies around the world. Like most other central banks and private sector analysts, through year-end 2021, we thought that inflation would subside fairly quickly without a sharp tightening in our policy stance, as this slide will show. When it became clear this was not the case, we responded forcefully, raising our policy rate by 5.25 percentage points over 16 months. That action, combined with the unwinding of pandemic supply disruptions, contributed to inflation moving much closer to our target without the painful rise in unemployment that has accompanied previous efforts to counter high inflation. This year's review considered how economic conditions have evolved over the past 5 years. During this period, we saw that the inflation situation can change rapidly in the face of large shocks. In addition, interest rates are now substantially higher than was the case during the era between the global financial crisis and the pandemic. With inflation above target, our policy rate is restrictive, modestly so in my view. We cannot say for certain where rates will settle out over the longer run, but their neutral rate may now be higher than during the 2010s, reflecting changes in productivity, demographics, fiscal policy, and other factors that affect the balance between saving and investment. During the review, we discussed how the 2020 statement's focus on the ELB may have complicated communications about our response to high inflation. We concluded that the emphasis on an overly specific set of economic conditions may have led to some confusion, and as a result, we made several important changes to the consensus statement to reflect that insight. First, we removed language indicating that the ELB was a defining feature of the economic landscape. Instead, we noted that our monetary policy strategy is designed to promote maximum employment and stable prices across a broad range of economic conditions. The difficulty of operating near the ELB remains a potential concern, but it is not our primary focus. The revised statement reiterates that the committee is prepared to use its full range of tools to achieve its maximum employment and price stability goals, particularly if the federal funds rate is constrained by the ELB. Second, we returned to a framework of flexible inflation targeting and eliminated the makeup strategy. As it turned out, the idea of an intentional moderate inflation overshoot had proved irrelevant. There was nothing intentional or moderate about the inflation that arrived a few months after we announced our 2020 changes to the consensus statement, as I acknowledged publicly in 2021. Well-anchored inflation expectations were critical to our success in bringing down inflation without a sharp increase in unemployment. Anchored expectations promote the return of inflation to target when adverse shocks drive inflation higher, and limit the risk of deflation when the economy weakens. Further, they allow monetary policy to support maximum employment in economic downturns without compromising price stability. Our revised statement emphasizes our commitment to act forcefully to ensure that longer-term inflation expectations remain well anchored to the benefit of both sides of our dual mandate. It also notes that price stability is essential for a sound and stable economy and supports the well-being of all Americans. This theme came through loud and clear at our Fed Listens events. The past 5 years have been a painful reminder of the hardship that high inflation imposes, especially on those least able to meet the higher costs of necessities. Third, our 2020 statement said that we would mitigate shortfalls rather than deviations from maximum employment. The use of shortfalls reflected the insight that our real-time assessments of the natural rate of unemployment, and hence of maximum employment, are highly uncertain. The later years of the post-global financial crisis recovery featured employment running for an extended period above mainstream estimates of its sustainable level, along with inflation running persistently below our 2% target. In the absence of inflationary pressures, it might not be necessary to tighten policy based solely on uncertain real-time estimates of the natural rate of unemployment. We still have that view, but our use of the term shortfalls was not always interpreted as intended, raising communications challenges. In particular, the use of shortfalls was not intended as a commitment to permanently forswear preemption or to ignore labor market tightness. Accordingly, we removed shortfalls from our statement. Instead, the revised document now states more precisely that the committee recognizes that employment may run at times above real-time assessments of maximum employment without necessarily creating risks to price stability. Of course, preemptive action would likely be warranted if tightness in the labor market or other factors pose risks to price stability. The revised statement also notes that maximum employment is the highest level of employment that can be achieved on a sustained basis in a context of price stability. This focus on promoting a strong labor market underscores the principle that durable achieving maximum employment fosters broad-based economic opportunities and benefits for all Americans. The feedback we received at Fed Listens events reinforced a strong labor market for American households, employers, and communities. Fourth, consistent with the removal of shortfalls, we made changes to clarify our approach in periods where our employment and inflation objectives are not complementary. In those circumstances, we will follow a balanced approach in promoting them. The revised statement now more closely aligns with the original 2012 language. We take into account the extent of departures from our goals and the potentially different time horizons over which each is projected to return to a level consistent with our dual mandate. These principles guide our policy decisions today, as they did in the 2022 to 24 period, when the departure from our 2% inflation target was the overriding concern. In addition to these changes, there is a great deal of continuity with past statements. The document continues to explain how we interpret the mandate Congress has given us and describes the policy framework that we believe will best promote maximum employment and price stability. We continue to believe that monetary policy must be forward-looking and consider the lags in its effects on the economy. For this reason, our policy actions depend on the economic outlook and the balance of risks to that outlook. We continue to believe that setting a numerical goal for employment is unwise because the maximum level of employment is not directly measurable and changes over time for reasons unrelated to monetary policy. We also continue to view a longer-run inflation rate of 2% as most consistent with our dual mandate goals. We believe that our commitment to this target is a key factor helping keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Experience has shown that 2% inflation is low enough to ensure that inflation is not a concern in household and business decision-making, while also providing a central bank with some policy flexibility to provide accommodation during economic downturns. Finally, the revised consensus statement retained our commitment to conduct a public review roughly every 5 years. There's nothing magic about the 5-year pace. That frequency allows policymakers to reassess structural features of the economy and to engage with the public, practitioners, and academics on the performance of our framework. It is also consistent with several global peers. To wrap up, I want to thank President Schmid and all of his great Kansas City staff who work so diligently to host this outstanding event annually. Counting a couple of virtual appearances during the pandemic, this is the 8th time I've had the honor to speak from this podium. Each year, this symposium offers the opportunity for Fed leaders to hear ideas from leading economic thinkers and focus on the challenges we face. The Kansas City Fed was very wise to lure Chair Volcker here to this national park more than 40 years ago, and I am so proud to be part of that tradition. Thank you very much.
That was Fed Chair Jerome Powell wrapping up his annual remarks. What a Jackson Hole speech that was. This is Bloomberg Surveillance on television and radio, live from Jackson Hole, Wyoming. What we heard there is they are prepared to move rates lower on the heels of their dual mandate being in conflict. We see a market reaction. We can see 10-year yields are lower by 10 basis points. 2-year yields are down by 10 basis points. 10-year yields are down by 7 basis points. What you see is a weaker dollar, stronger euro. 0.7%, which you can see the dollar just weakening across the board, and you can see that increase on the equity space. We have been getting some other news. President Trump has been tweeting saying that if Lisa Cook, Fed governor, doesn't resign, he will fire her. There also was some drama in the main hall of the Jackson Lake Lodge. Bloomberg's Michael McKee is with us. Mike, can you give us a picture of what's been going on as Jay Powell was speaking?
Well, it was, I guess, shortly before he spoke, Lisa Cook walked into the Jackson Lake Lodge. She was not here last night. She's just arrived. And James Fishback, who runs Zora Capital, he sued the Fed in court trying to get the Fed to open its meetings and the court threw that out. But he was standing there and started shouting at her, "Why did you commit mortgage fraud?" He was apparently, according to the Bloomberg reporters who were there, escorted out by sheriff's deputies.
Yeah.
I think we have to be clear here that these are allegations.
Absolutely.
That there are no charges, no processes in place at this time, right?
No processes in place at this time, and what we've seen from Bill Pulte from the Federal Housing Finance Administration and from the President are they're trying to say factually that she committed fraud, and there's no evidence of that yet.
We will discuss that at a later point. Right now, we're just still digesting the text of a 40 to 45-minute speech by Jerome Powell. It really compares to the 8-minute speech by 2022. There will be pain. This is a complicated moment. The market sees it as maybe a little less complicated, and to really digest what we just heard, Citi Wealth Chief Investment Officer Kate Moore, who's on set with us in her beloved Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And Kate, what's your impression? I mean, how much did what we just hear from Professor Jay Powell change your view of what the reaction function is going to be?
So it hasn't really changed my view. What I will say is in the last couple of weeks and talking to other people on the buy side and getting a sense for investors, people were moving a little bit more towards the 50-50 in September, even if that's not what was getting priced into the market. There was the sense that this tension between the market and to make this really difficult. And I think what we're hearing this morning is that the Fed is on path to start easing rates again or proceed with the cycle. But I don't think that the rest of the meetings to the end of this year and through 2026 are done deals yet. So much is going to be data dependent. So I see the market price moves in now with near certainty for September and on through the balance of the year. And I think we just have to watch the data.
Right, and watching the data in the Heritage Citigroup economics is Willem Bouter, Catherine Mann out the Bank of England and all. There's a complete international and holistic view. Is this ginormous, that's a fancy word, CFA word, folks, this ginormous investment in AI, is the certitudes of this summer, are they at risk given the tumult?
Well, I mean, tell me, it's really crowded. Most investor segments have been crowded around these secular themes. And for good reason, right? These companies are putting up big numbers. Every company across every industry is investing in AI and technology. So if you had uncertainty around policy or economic growth or geopolitical tensions or international relations or, fractures in the U.S. consumer, everyone was crowded in this space. It's not crowded because these are companies with, they're crowded because these companies have great fundamentals and the path forward looks great. But we'll have to see as we go into the back end of the year, if we get okay growth numbers, or if we get a little bit too perky, if we get rotations in the market. I think some of the rotations in August into the small cap was unwarranted in my view.
So we are sitting here after digesting that speech, and I'm going to have to go read it about 3 more times to really internalize all of the complicated messages laid out by Jerome Powell in his last speech as Fed Chair. Mike, before we continue, Michael McKee here, our Chief Economics Correspondent, can you just wrap through some of the key headlines once more so that we can really understand how big of a policy shift in some ways this really was?
Well, it's a policy shift, but one that has been signaled for a little while, which is why the market has been buying into it. But Powell basically accepted the market's argument that it looks like the market is being as a threat to the overall economy. And inflation is rising, but it may not rise as quickly as they had feared. And so therefore the door is open to a rate cut if we get supportive data from the CPI and the employment report that we get at the beginning of September. Now, the thing about what he said today that I think is important is once you open the door like that as Fed Chair, it's almost impossible to close it. It would take a lot in these data points that are coming out to change that view and go overwhelmingly towards the idea of a rate cut. So he's pretty much baked it in at this point. So I think what then happens is it goes to Kate's point about where we go from there. The folks will be in the other 2 meetings this year and then what you do into 2026. I think if you ask the and he would say, we don't know. That's the data dependent part. But for right now, we're going to give you what you think you need.
And right now what you are seeing is almost a certainty priced in for a rate cut next month. But Kate, one other thing you're seeing is weakness in the dollar on the heels of this.
Yeah.
Do you expect that to be very much an ongoing theme? It's just going to identify it, given that this is taking the dollar approach.
Yeah, you got to pause in terms of the weakening of the dollar after a really vicious weakening in the first part of this year. And I've heard a lot of currency strategists say, we're going to tread water for a little bit. We've made a lot of the adjustment. But if the market really believes with high conviction that we're going to continue a rate cut cycle, I think it's fair to assume that the dollar would weaken a little bit. I think most people would say,
you probably know this is approved for business starters. We've been for millions of small businesses over 25 years. We also print signs, shirts, and more. We print it. Print it all for 20% off for new customers at visitprint.com.
Even as the hedging some of the stuff and some of the concerns that have in the portfolio around uncertainty and perhaps pick up in volatility in September into the beginning of October with a little bit of
We'll catch up with Kate Moore. She's going to be sticking with us, City Chief Investment Officer, as we get through all the headlines and get some commentary. Joining us now is someone who is very familiar with these types of speeches. St. Louis Fed President James Bullard recently was in at the media talking about his preference for 100 basis points of rate cuts this year heading into 2026. Also potential contender, I should say, to be the next Fed Chair. Jim, how much are you seeing what we heard from Fed Chair Jay Powell and seeing anything different that you would really think that is if you were at that podium?
He used the speech to solidify expectations for 25 basis points in September. I was expecting that anyway. Markets were expecting that. He leaned into the most recent labor market report, which was very soft. And so I think that's a done deal. He didn't say too much about beyond that, what you want to do with the October meeting or the December meeting. I have said 100 basis points, going into 2026. So I think you could adjust as you go forward and eventually get a full basis point, but go slowly in order to watch the data. And then on the framework review, I'm sure much earlier in the year, they had targeted that they would have the framework discussion and that the speech to talk about changes to the framework. I thought those were thoughtful and they were well presented in this speech, and they're about what many have speculated on. So I think they did about as much as they can on the framework side.
Jimbo, Tom Keenan, good morning to you. I definitely consider this my conversation of the day. You served a lengthy term at the St. Louis Fed. You have lived the decline of a greater economy decades and decades ago to provide for a resurgent St. Louis. As the next chairman of the Fed, whoever that may be, do they have to manage for two American economies, a technology-driven, exceptional economy, and another, to use a cliche, America flat on her back? How would a chairman execute those two Americas?
Yeah, I think income and wealth distribution have become more salient topics for the Fed. It's not that clear how much the Fed can really do, provide interest rate policy for the whole economy. If you change the rate structure, that affects everyone, not just this one particular group that you might be targeting. So I think that's been something we've had to wrestle with, and I've actually done research on it myself to try to understand it better from my point of view. So I think this has been a theme for a while, and that'll be an important theme in macroeconomics going forward.
Mike McKee's got a lot of smarter questions than me on the immediacy of this speech. I'm going to ask one more distant question, Jimbo. You're at Purdue executing online technology education every single day. How do you define the new technology productivity that America faces? Is it enough to save us? Is it enough to add on to our present GDP?
Oh yeah, I think that the AI boom is, it's a general purpose technology that will diffuse through the economy. I think the key question is how fast does that actually diffuse? And sometimes markets can get ahead of themselves and think it's going to happen sooner. Sometimes and it happens faster than markets think. But nevertheless, any way you look at it, it's an important technology. It can drive productivity. And I think in higher education is one of the places where you can really have the biggest impact. We put an AI requirement in at the Daniels School here for every single student, and we're trying to expand that to all of Purdue. So I think that just shows you how important technology is.
Jim, it's Mike McKee. I have a question about sort of the process involved in this speech. The chairman is giving his own speech, but basically he says it's time to maybe adjust policy. He's speaking for the entire Open Market Committee. Going into a speech like this, would he have polled everybody? Does he think he has the votes for that? Because we've been speaking with officials here in Jackson Hole, and there's still some who are saying, well, we're not sure that we need to do that yet.
Yeah, he's going to report on the center of gravity of the committee, even though there might be people that have misgivings. At the June committee had a media dot plot of 2 rate reductions by the end of the year, and I think the minutes, suggested something that was more like 50-50, but then the labor market report came in. I think that tilted the balance. So he could have pushed back a little bit. I think financial markets were expecting him to be a little bit more hawkish here. In a 50-50 meeting where you would wait and see for the rest of the data to come in, but I don't think that's where the center of gravity is on the committee. So he went ahead and leaned in. I thought there was quite a bit of talk about the labor market at the beginning. You could have been a little more, emphasis on the low unemployment rate, for instance, and. He did come out at the end of that discussion saying, well, but we're a little bit nervous. So I think, I think he's accurately describing where the bulk of the committee is.
Where would you be on this question? Because we've heard officials some time now saying, yes, we had poor job creation in recent months, but the unemployment rate, as you just mentioned, has been low, and they've described the labor market as solid. Now it seems to be sort of a major shift in the way they view the outlook and the sort of balance between the two mandates.
Yeah, he did at the end of that discussion, he said, how's in balance? But I think the committee's nervous. I think it has been slowing. And I think the policy rate is moderately restrictive. It's maybe 125 basis points above the neutral rate. Is that really where you want to be in this circumstance? I think the answer is no. So you can come down some and still have moderately restrictive policy that puts gentle downward pressure on inflation. And then the other thing that I think has happened is that this argument from Chris Waller and others on the committee that you should look through the one-time increase in goods prices coming from tariffs. I think that's carrying the day, and then he emphasized that inflation expectations remain anchored, and so on. And so I think that sets up a modest move downward in September.
Jim, we've been talking with you for years, and you're very focused on the discipline of economics. Right now, I'm looking at the headlines that are crossing from past years. The top one, of course, is Jerome Powell saying that she was to become the chair.
I want to see, you can make charges against anybody about anything, I guess, and the person can answer the charges and the DOJ can decide what they want to do and so on. So I think this should have longer to play out before you took that step. Otherwise, it's just is kind of the Wild West, and should you get reinstated later, I guess, or something if there wasn't a conviction. So it seems to me, I think these kinds of charges are made from time to time against various officials around Washington, but I'd like to see due process there.
Jim, there's another question here, and aside from Governor Cook and what happens there, about how the perception of political interference handles the market reaction to Fed policy. There's a perception that because there's more emphasis on supporting growth and supporting the labor market and beating inflation.
What value do I provide to the market that touches a person, that makes you feel something, makes you want to connect to? You see the difference? So when you're networking, right? Think about it as an artist. How many times have you went somewhere with the goal of networking, right? Networking is a business term. Networking is, I have some business that I'm looking to progress. So I'm searching for assets that can help. And maybe I'll help them as well, but you're really getting to benefit yourself. Another, you want people to pay you. It's the ultimate goal, right? In the hard work, the goal, unless you're just business minded, the goal is to find people that genuinely enjoy the art that you create, whether it's me,
I think the committee has to maneuver if they proceed carefully over the remainder of 25 and the first half of 2026.
I don't want to get out front of the debate here or the moment, Jim, but what I would say to you, and I'm turn to you. You and I used to look at the dots and go, which one is Bullard? I mean, you and I
Well, it's fairly easy after a while to figure out. I Jim would probably agree with that.
Chairman Bullard, it's your first act to take over the Fed. It's your first act to get rid of the dots.
I threatened to, as president, I threatened to withdraw from the dot plot. I think this could be done better. This was discussed at the Framework Conference, and former Chair Bernanke gave a very nice presentation and talk